For 6.3 notes, we're going to be talking about rectangles. In my definition, a rectangle is a quadrilateral with 4 right angles. So if you look at the diagram, all the angles are right angles. Also, it shares the properties of a parallelogram. Okay, that means the opposite sides are parallel. The opposite sides are congruent. I guess this technically needs 2 arrows. The opposite sides are congruent. Opposite angles are congruent. Consecutive angles add up to 180. And the diagonals that bisect each other. Okay? And what's special, again, it has 4 right angles, but the diagonals bisect each other, but the diagonals are also congruent. So we look at the diagram, if we draw in 2 diagonals, okay, they bisect each other, so they're cutting this and this in half, and that in half, but because the diagonals are congruent, that means the pieces formed by cutting each other in half, by bisecting each other, are also congruent. So all 4 of these little pieces formed from the 2 diagonals are also the same distance. So if we look at this example, okay, we want to find M and L. M and L. We want to find this angle right here. Okay. Well, we know, because it is a rectangle, we know it's a parallelogram, we know the opposite sides are parallel. So if 2 parallel lines being cut by a transversal, well, we know we have alternate interior angles. So we know this angle right here is congruent to this angle right there. But the problem is, one equation has a y and the other equation has an x. So setting them equal to each other isn't really going to work out. But we do know that all the angles of a rectangle are right angles. So we can take this equation right here and add it. We take 5x plus 3x plus 2, and it's going to equal 90, because all the angles of a rectangle are 90 degrees. So we can take the 2 little angles that make it up, add them together, and it's going to equal 90. We can solve for x. So we combine like terms. So we get 8x plus 10 is equal to 90. Go ahead, subtract 10 on both sides. So we get 8x is equal to 80. Divide by 8, divide by 8. So x ends up equaling 10. And I'll write that a little neater. X ends up equaling 10. What's nice about this problem is, again, we said that these 2 angles, this angle and this angle, were congruent. So all we really have to do is just take 10, plug it in for x here. When we plug it in, 3 times 10 is 30, plus 2 is 32. Well, because these angles are congruent, then we know that angle M and L is also 32 degrees. And there we go, we're done with that problem. Now you could have, once you found x, you could have plugged it in, got 32, said 6y plus 2 equals 32, solved for y, got y equals 5, plugged 5 in, and you still would have gotten 32. So you would have just made a lot more work for yourself. So either way is the correct way, but this is a lot less work and a lot less time. So we look at the next problem. We are going to do a proof. Let's make your 2 columns. We have our statements and reasons. By now you know the first reason is given. The first statement is the info given to us. And we know our very last statement is what we're trying to prove. We're trying to prove that WY is congruent to ZX. We have to fill in everything in between. What's going to be really helpful for you is if you go ahead and draw this rectangle. WXY. Oh, forgot my X. Said X, didn't write it. WX, Y, and Z. And then it has the diagonals. WY and XZ. And we're going to prove that those diagonals are congruent. Well, again, with these parallelogram proofs, whether it's a rectangle or a parallelogram, anything, you're trying to prove that these 2 triangles are congruent. So make sure the triangles you pick, because there's more than one, has the diagonals in it. So I'm going to pick, I'll pick this triangle right here. And then I'll pick this triangle right here. Okay, those are kind of the same colors. So I'll re-highlight that one. We'll do pink. We'll talk about this triangle right here. That green and that yellow, very same, so make that pink. Okay, that's going to be really helpful. Redraw these triangles. Take them out because they're kind of laying on top of one another, kind of mashed up in this rectangle. I'm going to go ahead and redraw them. So we know this is W, this is X, and this is Z. And then redraw the pink one. And we know this is W, Z, and Y. So we're going to take things we know about rectangles and parallelograms to help us prove that these 2 triangles are congruent. And once we know these 2 triangles are congruent, then we know their diagonals are congruent. Okay? Well, our next statement and reason, we know that the opposite sides of rectangles are the same. So we know these sides in our triangles are also the same. So we can say XW is congruent to YZ. And our reason, if you notice in this first statement, we have a vocab word with no math. So our reason is going to be definition of vocab word. Definition of a rectangle. Okay. There's one part. We also know because it's a rectangle, rectangles have 4 right angles. Well, this is a right angle and that's a right angle. From the diagram, we're taking that part and pulling it out into the triangle. Okay? Well, we know that angle XWZ is congruent to, if we went XWZ, that means we have to do YZW. XWZ, YZW. I think we went from purple to nothing, so we have to go purple to nothing. And our reason behind that is because they're both right angles. We know they're 90 degrees. And we know all right angles are congruent. Okay, so there's two parts. If you notice, if you look back up in the diagram, we shaded this side WZ with yellow, and we shaded it with pink. And if you notice in the two triangle diagrams, they both have labeled sides WZ. That means they're sharing that side. So we know WZ is congruent to WZ, and whenever two triangles are sharing a side, it's the reflexive property. Okay. Well, we have all three pieces. We know triangle. If you don't know how to label the triangles, just rewrite the angle but with the triangle symbol. XWZ is congruent to triangle YZW. And the parts that we have are side, angle, side. Side, angle, side. Side, angle, side. Okay. Now that we know that these two triangles are congruent, we know their corresponding parts are congruent. So that's congruent to that. We know the diagonals, if you look, and the rectangle are congruent. So we can finally say that the diagonals are congruent, and the reason is C, P, C, T, C. Once you know that the two triangles are congruent, you can state their parts are congruent, because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are. There we go. You are done with the notes.